Hello and welcome to the Smart Recovery Podcast, your audio headquarters for inspiring and insightful discussions on the topic of addiction recovery. What you'll hear with us will be self-empowering, science-based, and stigma-free. We believe you have the power within yourself to make changes that will move you toward a more satisfying life. And we hope these messages and interviews with leading addiction experts and advocates will help you believe that too. Remember that the purpose of this podcast is to educate and inform. It is not a substitute for medical care from a doctor or other qualified medical professionals. Before making any changes in your treatment plan, please discuss your thoughts with your medical provider.
Today's guest on the podcast is Bill Greer, current board president of SMART. He has spent the past 3 years presenting SMART to the organization's stakeholders, chairing the SMART USA Communications Committee, chairing the Smart Recovery International's Brand and Communications Committee, all while serving as president at a time of great change in how treatment and recovery are understood. Bill also devoted significant time leading Smart Recovery International's initial effort to define the SMART model and brand for the international community. Bill has an intellectual background grounded in science, philosophy, and religion, with a master's in journalism from the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University and a BA with honors from Lawrence University. He draws upon all these disciplines in understanding and leading SMART. Additionally, Bill has facilitated almost every type of SMART meeting, including the most challenging ones for inmates in maximum security jails, for which he has earned awards, and for family and friends. Bill also has the lived experience of growing up with family members suffering from addiction and using SMART to recover from his own addiction and other major life challenges. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you very much, Luke. Good to be here.
Today, we're going to focus on language as it relates to the field of helping those with addictive behavior. Bill recently wrote a fascinating article, can be found on Smart Recovery website, amending some words used to describe Smart Recovery's stance on abstinence from addictive and problematic behavior. But before we dive into that article specifically, I'd like to first talk about how Smart Recovery has historically been very outspoken about other terminology regarding people and approaches to recovery, starting with not using the terms addict and alcoholic. Can you tell us more about why the words alcoholic and addict are not used in Smart Recovery?
Yes, Luke. I think Smart Recovery has always been mindful of the adverse or stigmatizing effect of certain labels can have on people and their recovery efforts. Obviously, the most classic examples are addict and alcoholic, or worse, names like junkie or dealer, or even the word clean is something that I think can be problematic for some people. I think it has an effect on people where they confuse who they are with the behavior they're trying to change. So they have a sense that they're a bad person, or they're a person with a serious problem, and it's an identity issue that comes into play. And really all they have is a behavioral problem that they need to fix, albeit a significant behavioral problem. But as SMART tries to help people, we try to help them differentiate between who they are and the behavior they need to change. And if you're confusing the behavior with their identity by calling them an addict or an alcoholic or a junkie, I think that has an adverse effect on many people's efforts to make the changes needed to recover. It can be very discouraging. Now, in some cases, people find that using those labels works for them. I understand that. But for a lot of people, I think SMART has discovered that those labels do not work and can have an adverse impact on their recovery efforts.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense to me. And you even mentioned the word clean, because then what is the opposite, or what's opposed to clean is dirty.
Yeah, and it's funny, and we all kind of automatically use that term. I still do it. It's in my head, and every time I say it, I try to catch myself. But that some of these words are really ingrained in our vocabulary, and we have to really be careful about that. I think it's SMART. We know that quite a lot because we understand how the thoughts that we're giving to our recovery efforts and our addiction, the words that we're using to describe it, can have a pretty serious effect on our efforts to recover and how we're motivated and dealing with the changes that we need to make.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But again, before we start talking about abstinence-oriented versus abstinence-based, are there any other kinds of language that SMART discourages or asks facilitators not to use?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think there's a lot of words we have to be careful about, and particularly the meaning that people attach to them. Even the word relapse, for example, came out as a difficult term for some people. Looking at the research that was presented at our conference last September, it came out, the research shows that about 75% of people who try to recover are going to have relapses in the first year of their recovery. 75%, 3 in 4 people. And if those relapses make them think that their recovery has totally failed, and they have this meaning attached to relapses that suggests that they're failing at their addiction efforts, that's a very demotivating factor as well. I'm not suggesting necessarily we not use that term, although perhaps the word lapse or slip might be a better alternative. But in SMART, we try to help people understand what relapses mean and the opportunity that they provide to improve and fine-tune your recovery effort and not see them as such a negative event in the recovery effort, because they're a very common event and something you really have to be prepared for. And that includes not only the people who are recovering, but their family members and friends. And it'd be helpful if they would see relapses in a more positive, or not a positive light, but a less negative light, let's say.
So that might, I'm sorry?
I think Carlo Di Clementi suggested the term recycle. I don't know if that one works necessarily, but I think people are having trouble with that term as well.
So there's a sensitivity there, even if it's not an absolute, instruction, I guess, to facilitators. And just to follow up, that's very true that it doesn't mean if you have a lapse or a slip, it doesn't mean that everything you've learned or the time that you spent addressing your problematic behavior then is for naught.
Absolutely. And that's something that I think we emphasize a lot in our meetings. The classic analogy that we often use is, say you're driving a car from, I live in Washington, D.C., and say I'm driving to Boston, and I get a flat tire in New York on my way to Boston. Now, I don't change the flat tire and drive back to Washington, D.C., and in effect start my journey all over again. I change the tire and, looking at that as a relapse, and then proceed to my ultimate destination, which is Boston. So I think that's how we look at relapse, as an opportunity to learn, fix what's wrong, strengthen your recovery efforts, and do what you need to do to succeed ultimately.
Yeah. Okay, so let's switch to that article. And one thing right away that I noticed was that in the article that you're noting the change in wording from the term abstinence-based, you write, quote, "We adopted the abstinence-oriented term to distance SMART from dangerous and misinformed views about the use of medications." Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yes, absolutely. And I guess there's some personal history I can share with that. When I joined the SMART Recovery Board about 3 years ago, I was asked to join because of my background in communications. I started paying very close attention to the way recovery was being talked about, and then particularly looking at the opioid epidemic, which is very much in the news, still is obviously. And I started seeing stories and headlines that simply declared that abstinence-based treatment does not work. People who are trying to use that approach and recovering from opioid use disorder are not succeeding with an abstinence-based approach, and that kind of struck me as what's going on here. And then I realized that when they talked about abstinence-based, they were referring to abstaining also, not only from the heroin or the pills or whatever it was they were addicted to, but also from the medications, the opioid agonists, methadone, buprenorphine, that they needed as part of their recovery process. And so I was finding out, I guess it's not news to a lot of people, that an important part of recovering from opioid use disorder is having access to these medications, because they're very important in protecting people essentially from fatal overdoses, and also helping them sustain themselves during their recovery process. But I guess there has been this idea, and there still is quite widespread in the United States, that when you're using these medications, you're not really in recovery. You are not clean. In fact, that is exactly how that's often described. And so people who are using medications to try to recover from opioid use disorders are not seen as in recovery. And I noticed there's a tendency, or there's still a trend in treatment to not use those medications. I think the medications are not available still in a lot of places, because even in the treatment community, there still is a sense that using these medications is not really a valuable part of recovery. There's this idea that using these medications is simply, quote, substituting one drug for another, because these medications do have small amounts of opioids in them. So the notion is, because they have opioids in them, you're not really recovering. You're not clean. You're not pure and taking and being entirely off opioids. Even though the reason you have those medications that have small amounts of opioids is to maintain your tolerance to opioids, so that if and when you do relapse, which unfortunately, as I indicated earlier, is extremely common, you're not endangering yourself or your health, because it's pretty common now, unfortunately, for people to have very serious health consequences when they relapse and they're trying to recover from opioid use disorder. When their tolerance level goes way down during the recovery process, when they relapse, that can overwhelm their system, lead to respiratory shutdown, and kill them. A lot of the opioid overdoses are due to that very phenomenon. You have 50,000 people dying a year now from opioid overdoses. I don't know what the percentage is, but a large number of those people are people who are actually trying to recover. I mean, that's incredible to me. The people who are trying to recover and are being told they can't use these medications are the ones who are, in many cases, who are dying from the overdoses. I mean, that doesn't make sense to me at all. I just find that incredibly awful. And when I see that abstinence-based programs are being associated with this problem, I said, whoa, wait, we don't want SMART to be associated with this kind of treatment. So that made me start to think, we really don't want to be in that space where people understand abstinence-based recovery as meaning you can't use these medications as well. Now, SMART has always allowed the use of medications, even before we were talking about the agonists. But I think we felt that we needed this word change to help distinguish SMART from these so-called abstinence-based programs that in many cases were proving to be very dangerous to people trying to recover from opioid use disorders. Mm-hmm. Now, we thought of eliminating the term abstinence altogether, but that's really not something that we can do easily in the United States. And so abstinence-oriented seemed to be the best alternative right now, and that applies to our efforts to help people recover from all kinds of drugs and substances that you have to abstain from completely and ultimately when you're trying to recover in many cases.
Yeah, I find that a very significant point, and you do touch on that or go a little bit into depth in your article by talking about abstinence-based recovery being dangerous because, as you write, this recovery method kills people when the opioid addicted are not allowed to take agonists or pushed to get off those medications before the recovery is secure enough to prevent relapses. I mean, that's the point you're making. It is actually dangerous, not just a matter of preference or such.
And I'm not the only one saying that. I mean, I think a lot of experts in the field are saying that as a matter of public policy, as the gold standard in treating people for opioid use disorder. When people have a severe opioid addiction, they really have to use these agonists to help them recover safely. And they may have to use these agonists for a very long time. Unfortunately, it would be nice if they didn't have to, but if the alternative is risking your life, I don't think that's a hard choice to make.
Yeah.
And I want SMART to be associated with recovery that allows those medications to be used and doesn't stigmatize people who are using these medications, so that they can have a place to go and talk about their recovery and be accepted and their recovery being supported. So we want SMART meetings to be a place where people using medication-assisted treatment can go and get the recovery support that they need.
Yeah. Again, it's quite a significant kind of statement and idea that both, as you said, you and others have written about. Let me ask you this, Bill. How might you respond to the view that the word changes we're talking about is kind of much ado about nothing?
Well, I hope I made that clear. If we're talking about life and death here, I mean, I guess maybe to an outsider, saying abstinence-based versus abstinence-oriented may not seem like a huge change. But I think within the addiction field, when abstinence-based, precludes or discourages the use of these life-saving medications, I don't think that distinction becomes extremely important. And when we want people to understand that our orientation towards abstinence allows the use of these medications, so we don't want to be in the same group as people who are preventing the use of medications for people trying to recover. So, oriented is one way of preserving our abstinence orientation, our abstinence focus, which is what SMART meetings do. I mean, we help people learn how to stop engaging in addictive behavior. We want people to, understand we're still doing that in our program. We're not a moderation program, as some people like to think, and it's not really true, where we help people stop addictive behavior. And we need to maintain that understanding as people are looking at SMART and trying to understand where we fit in the recovery field, and at least in the United States.
Mm. Well, that gets exactly to this point that I know you've spent a great deal of your career in communications-related positions, leadership positions. So there is kind of a fundamental belief that there is a power to language.
Yes, well, language is extremely powerful. I've seen, I could look at Mark Twain's famous statement, which I always liked as a writer. The difference between the almost right word and the right word is the difference between the lightning bug and the lightning. So that's when I'm writing, I'm always thinking about, trying to figure out the best words to use in describing something. And I'm, as you're a writer too, we always try to work on that quite a lot. But I think in my career, and I've been involved in a number of legislative campaigns, major ones that have involved Congress, and I've seen single words or phrases meaning the difference in the success or failure of huge legislative campaigns. A classic example years ago, I don't know, people may recall the campaign to eliminate the estate tax. When they called that the death tax, that term really had made a huge difference in how people viewed that particular issue. A more recent example I was very involved in was efforts to eliminate so-called interchange fees that credit cards and banks charge when you make a credit card transaction. When we were calling these interchange fees, and this is a 2 to 3% charge that's assessed on every single transaction that somebody makes with a credit card. What does an interchange fee mean? Well, when we started calling those swipe fees, which kind of connotes that something's being stolen, which is the points that we wanted to make. Well, that made a huge difference in how that campaign now was going, and ultimately I was with the retail organizations that were fighting these interchange fees. That had a lot to do with some of the success of this legislative effort. I think when you get to the field of addiction, though, your words start to take a much more serious importance because of the fact we're dealing with serious health issues, and as I indicated earlier, when we're dealing with life or death, if you're using the wrong words, and that can influence people to not take the kind of medication that they need to take, or in their recovery efforts to think that they've failed and they're not succeeding because they relapsed. I think people who are trying to recover already have a very negative view of themselves. They feel ashamed, and they're trying to recover their identity and their sense of self-confidence. And the words that people are using just in their thought process internally, and how people are describing them, are extremely important. SMART understands how thoughts and beliefs have a lot to do with your recovery. And if you can figure out the right way to describe those thoughts and understand those beliefs, your recovery can go a lot better and progress further.
Yeah. And of course, that's cognitive training, cognitive behavioral kinds of approaches. But
absolutely.
Kind of getting wrapping up here in a couple minutes. Are there any other language or communication issues that SMART plans to address in the future?
I don't actually not immediately, I think, but it's funny that the one thing that I got into when I was trying to figure out how to present SMART from a branding standpoint. I was very involved with Smart Recovery International in the year 2018, starting a branding initiative, trying to figure out what makes SMART different from all the other recovery support programs. What makes SMART special, and how can we distinguish ourselves from all the others? And it really wasn't the term abstinence-based or abstinence-oriented. It was beyond that. I think the fact that we're focusing on recovery and life beyond addiction became a real important part of what distinguishes SMART from other approaches to recovery. And I think as we go forward in trying to present SMART not only to the United States audience, but to the world, I think we need to focus on the positive aspects of our program and how we help people not just stop the addictive behavior that they're engaging in, but building a new life and renewing their life with a new lifestyle and healthy activities that support that in their full and long-term recovery. As we know in our point 4 of the SMART program, it's building a new life, learning how to lead a healthy and fulfilling life that really makes a difference in determining whether you recover for the long term. Just stopping the behavior is only the first step. It's a critical step, but unless you get that new lifestyle together, those new behaviors, that healthy lifestyle, a sense of purpose in life, that's what recovery is all about long term, and that's what we help people accomplish in SMART. And I think that's one of the things that makes SMART distinctive from other groups, our emphasis on leading a balanced and fulfilling and purposeful life.
Right. Those are excellent points, Bill, and I appreciate how well you're able to bring those to the forefront and describe them, because I think, and also those examples you used about the power of language, really great stuff, and I appreciate that. Finally, is there anything else you'd like listeners to consider about the change from abstinence-based to abstinence-oriented?
I think associated with that, I think it's important that facilitators and regional coordinators and others who speak on behalf of our program need to be emphasizing that our acceptance of people who are using medication-assisted treatment. I think that point needs to be brought out a lot more forcefully, so that the people who are using that treatment really understand it. I did a Facebook Live event with a group called Faces of Opioids, a group that has like 60,000 people who are recovering from opioid addiction or have lost loved ones to opioid addiction. And when they learn that SMART exists and we have this whole program that accepts people who are using medication-assisted treatment, they were just delighted to find that out, because a lot of their members were encountering a lot of resistance at meetings where they were not accepted because they were using medication-assisted treatment, and many of them were stopping that treatment because of that, or trying to get off that treatment prematurely, and they were just delighted to find out we had this SMART program, and we have an increasing number of meetings to support them And I think it's important that facilitators emphasize that as they're talking to people in their meetings and welcoming more people who are trying to recover from opioid use disorders. I think particularly that's happening in among younger people who we need to attract to our meetings in greater numbers. So I think that would be another message I'd like to emphasize.
Okay, well, that's, again, a great point and a great explanation of some of the differences that SMART, how they approach, how the field of dealing with addictive behavior. We've been speaking with Bill Greer, Board President of Smart Recovery USA. Thank you, Bill. Thank you for contributing both the article and this podcast.
Thank you, Luke.
Thanks for listening to the Smart Recovery Podcast. If you found today's episode helpful and inspiring, we encourage you to share it with someone who might need to hear its messages. If you or someone you know needs addiction-related help, we encourage you to visit smartrecovery.org to find a wealth of digital resources, practical tools, and social supports meant to help you and your loved ones on their recovery journey. While there, you can search for a local SMART meeting near you, or join our online community to find 24/7 access to recovery help through regular online meetings and helpful message boards and forums. All of our meetings and online community resources are completely free of charge. Be sure to connect with us online to get more helpful addiction-related resources. Visit our website at smartrecovery.org, where you can search for local meetings, join our online community, subscribe to our e-newsletter, and find regular blogs, videos, podcasts, and more. You can also help us to spread our self-empowering, science-based messages to more people who need to hear from them in important ways. First, get trained on the Smart Recovery Program. If you are a licensed healthcare provider and could benefit from using Smart Recovery in your professional work, or if you are someone who would like to volunteer and lead Smart Recovery meetings in your community, please check out our training and volunteer opportunities at www.smartrecovery.org/training. Second, donate to support our work. Smart Recovery is a nonprofit that runs on the donations from generous supporters who understand the need for recovery-related support. If you would like to help us reach more people, consider donating to Smart Recovery at smartrecovery.org/donate. We'd like to thank US World Meds for their generous support of this episode. We'll see you next time on the next episode of the Smart Recovery Podcast.